from the Heart.
Hello and welcome back to Horror from the Heart. I'm Josh, and today we're going to be talking about horror in video games. Now, this is a subject I could probably get like a lot of stuff out on, just kind of like the movies, because I love the hell out of horror video games. Now, to start off with, like, horror video games are a lot different compared to how they used to be, and I mean a lot different. One of the earliest horror video games I think that was out there was like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the Atari 2600. You literally played as Leatherface, and it had the most annoying sound in the world. I never got to play that one because I think that one actually, I want to say it was like limited as far as where it was actually sold, or places didn't want to sell it because of the nature of it. But regardless, though, as the years progressed, they kind of changed, and you were more of a hero defeating, the evil or whatever you want to say, compared to how it used to be. Now, the very first game that I ever played in the horror genre would have been the Commodore 64 Nightmare on Elm Street. And like I said, it was, if you checked out one of the previous episodes, I kind of talked about it a little bit. It was based loosely, and I mean very, very loosely, off of the third movie. So it was the Dream Warriors. You literally played as any of the 6 kids that were there and were trying to defeat Freddy. And it was really, really freaky for the time being. You look back at it now and it's like, that's not really all that creepy. I mean, but, as graphics progress and gameplay progresses and things like that, of course, older games don't seem as fantabulous as they are now. But it was more imaginative than it was anything else. But one of the other horror games I used to love playing as a kid, there was a arcade in one of the malls that was close by to where we lived at. And anytime we went over there, I always made it a point to try and stop at that arcade. And the game was Splatterhouse. Now, you're talking about a big jump from how the Commodore 64 stuff looked, where it was like, basically like 6-bit, 8-bit graphics kind of style, to 16-bit graphics, basically, with a game like Splatterhouse. Now, that one was really fun. You played as a different character. You were sitting there trying to basically defeat evil, but it got really, really grotesque. And that's mainly because of the factor of just how the graphics have improved. But it also goes into that whole aspect of how they've changed. Now, one of the really cool things about that is horror, as I said, in itself has a lot of influence in a lot of different areas. And video games is definitely one of those areas, because you can go into a lot of different video games that aren't horror video games, but horror has had an influence in it. I mean, you can go into, like, example would be one of the old Star Wars games, the one for Nintendo 64, Shadow of the Empire. The sewer level was more of a horror aspect than it was anything else, because I know as being younger, that one was kind of freaky. But you do have other games out there that have freaky things. Half-Life is another one of those ones where it's not really a horror video game, but you get into certain areas and it's really kind of creepy and grotesque in certain ways. So horror has had a lot of influence. Even with the way some of the villains are done in non-horror video games, they're more horrific than they are anything else. And not every single game that's out there, but a lot of the games that have come around, you have a really kind of grotesque type of monster nowadays. I mean, Rage 2 is not a horror game, in my opinion, in like any kind of way, but you look at the way that one is, and it's, yeah, the one villain he's pretty creepy looking. I mean, it's just a head on a robot. But that's just like one kind of an example compared to a lot of the ones that are out there. Now, horror video games are kind of in that same vein as the way the movies have gone, where there's a lot of different kind of genres out there. Now, it used to be just horror video games because it had horror elements in it, and it was either kind of freaky or they weren't freaky at all, and it was just horror elements. But then you tend to progress, and it gets to the point of you have different types that are out there. So there's a game out there called Clock Tower, and it's basically a point and click adventure where you're running away from a scissor man, guy with a giant pair of scissors. But it's a different type of genre because it was a point and click. And then you had like Resident Evil, which was one of the ones that started with the whole survival horror style of game. And that's one of the genres that is out there, is the survival horror. And then you have like the first person ones. Alien Isolation was fantastic. You can tell me that's not horror, you can tell me that's sci-fi, but that's like a sci-fi horror type of thing because, oh my god, yeah, your heart races when you're playing that one. But then you have other ones that are more psychological in a lot of different ways, where Silent Hill is one of those examples where there are things in there that are just absolutely gross and disgusting and freaky looking, but there's a lot of psychological stuff that's in there too. Or Condemned was one of those ones where it had a lot of different kind of horror elements in there, but it was a lot of psychological type of stuff too, because it was people getting into your head about things. But a lot of them have progressed too. And then, I mean, hell, we even have Dead by Daylight nowadays, where you literally have 4 people, or not 4 people. Don't quote me on that one, because it's been a little while since I've actually played Dead by Daylight. But you have several different people that are playing as survivors, and you have one person that's playing as a killer. I mean, they even had a Friday the 13th version of that kind of way, where it was just Jason Voorhees type of stuff. And then you have other ones where you rarely get to play as the villain, but there are a few games out there where you do play as the villain in a horror video game. Carry On is kind of like one of those ones where you're this grotesque blob running around killing people. Well, not running around even. I mean, you're rolling around and swinging and all that kind of stuff, but you get what I mean. It's that kind of thing. But over the years, it's changed into things like that, where you have the ability to be able to do that kind of stuff. A lot of games nowadays have a morality system, so you can take something and either be the good guy or the bad guy, but you don't really get to see that kind of stuff in horror video games that are out there. I know a lot of them nowadays, I think, tend to rely on more of the grotesque than it is the actual aspect of being horror in certain ways, kind of like the way movies have done in a lot of different ways. But there are certain ones out there that really kind of give you that creepy vibe because of just how it is. And there's even been books that have been adapted into playing into the video game aspect. Not really one for one or anything like that, or this is a direct story of anything like that, but some of them are done like that. So you have Vampire the Masquerade. There's books out there. There's a game out there that is a tabletop type of style. Vampire the Masquerade is one of those great ones. It was an RPG. And you literally played as vampires. Or you have a lot of the H.P. Lovecraft stuff that's out there. So the Call of Cthulhu, there's like a few different games that are based off the Cthulhu mythos. And then you have other ones that are out there where it's like, it's not really, you could kind of consider it a horror game, but at the same time, you may not consider it a horror game. But something like Don't Starve. Don't Starve is one of those ones where it's very creepy in its art style, kind of Tim Burton-esque in a way, but there's horror elements to it because it's the whole survival aspect of that, or The Long Dark, or 7 Days to Die. There's survival horror games that are out there that are like that, and it's really neat the way we have progressed with a lot of these ones. I mean, hell, even Resident Evil went through a whole phase of actually being survival horror to turning into more of like an action horror type of game, and to going back into the latest one that was out at the time, where it was more of a freaky kind of scary because it puts you in a first-person perspective. And hopefully the next one that comes out actually kind of keeps that trend of being good scary rather than action scary. I mean, and there is that whole aspect too, where there are action horror games, kind of like there's action horror that's out there. You don't see it all that often, but it's there. Now, one of the things I'm kind of curious about is how this can change. How could this progress? How could we make it freaky again? Because there are a lot of the ones where it's like you tend to have the whole jump scare aspect. Five Nights at Freddy's, Never played a single one of those, but I've actually seen a lot of the gameplay that's there. I mean, kids love the hell out of that one for what it's worth. But basically, the game was nothing but jump scares. And the whole point that made you tense about that thing was the factor of you waiting for the jump scare because you knew the jump scare was coming. But you don't really get that too much in video games where you get a jump scare. But it does happen. And a lot of games can rely on that in certain ways. But you don't see it too often. But to me, it's kind of like in the same thing with, and maybe, it could be an age thing, could be a nostalgia type of thing. But I don't think the horror video games are as creepy as they used to be. I think one of the last horror video games that I really got to sit down and play that actually kind of gave me a fright was the PT demo. That one, I mean, I literally felt freaked out and creeped out by that whole entire thing, just because the way it was. Yeah, there was a couple jump scares that were in there, but I wasn't expecting